I never thought the day would come when my own son would try to kill me. But there he was, smiling across the dinner table in New York City, pouring wine into my glass with the same hands I once held when he took his first steps. The house was full of laughter, family, friends, the clatter of forks against china. To everyone else, it was Thanksgiving. To me, it was a trap. I watched closely as Michael's hand lingered just a second too long over my glass. I caught the flicker of nervousness in his eyes when he slid it toward me. No one else noticed, but I did. A father always notices. I raised the glass, pretending not to care, pretending not to see the fine white powder dissolving at the bottom. Around me, the room cheered, waiting for me to drink. My son leaned back in his chair, his smile too wide, too rehearsed. That was the moment I understood, my own blood had turned against me. I didn't drink. Not yet. Instead, I smiled back at him, my heart pounding with rage and disbelief. Because if Michael thought he could bury me quietly, he was about to learn a truth no son should ever forget. A father may forgive. But a father never forgets. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. I kept the glass in my hand, swirling the red liquid slowly as if I were admiring its body and aroma. In reality, I was buying myself time. My pulse hammered in my ears, but my face betrayed nothing. The people around the table laughed, toasted, and argued about football games on TV. None of them noticed the storm brewing in my chest. But I noticed everything. I noticed how Michael avoided looking directly at me, his eyes darting instead to the glass, then to the clock on the wall, then back again. I noticed the way his leg bounced nervously under the table, a rhythm he couldn't control. And I noticed how his hand trembled when he reached for his own wine. The betrayal wasn't just in the powder at the bottom of my glass. It was in his body language, his silence, his guilt. I raised the glass halfway to my lips, and in that moment, Michael leaned forward ever so slightly. His breath caught. He was waiting for the poison to finish what he had started. But instead of drinking, I set the glass down slowly, deliberately, letting the stem tap against the tablecloth with a sound that made him flinch. My son had no idea that I had already seen him slip the powder in earlier, just before dinner began. He thought he was clever, but he underestimated the one person in the world who had studied him longer than anyone else. Me. So, while he believed I was moments away from swallowing death, I was already thinking 10 steps ahead. How do you punish a son who tries to murder his father? Do you confront him in front of everyone, shattering the illusion of family? Do you quietly outwit him, making him choke on his own treachery? Or do you wait, bide your time, and let him believe he's in control, just long enough to pull the ground out from beneath his feet? As the table roared with laughter at another joke I didn't hear, I made my decision. I would play along. I would let my son think he had one. And when the time was right, I would remind him of a truth far more lethal than poison. No son, no matter how cunning, should ever underestimate the father who raised him. That was the night Michael tried to kill me. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that it would become the beginning of a game. A game of betrayal. A game of vengeance. A game only one of us would survive. And I had no intention of losing. The night ended like any other, at least for everyone else. The dishes were cleared, laughter faded into the living room, and the glow of the television filled the house with its artificial comfort. But I wasn't comforted. I was haunted. Haunted not by the powder in my wine glass, but by the question clawing at my chest, why? Why would my own son, my flesh and blood, want me dead? Michael was only 22. A bright student, a promising athlete once, a boy who used to climb onto my shoulders when he was small and shout that he was taller than the world. He was the boy I once believed would carry my name with pride. But at that table, I hadn't seen my little boy. I'd seen a stranger with shaking hands and guilt painted across his face. And strangers always have motives. That night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling while the house grew silent. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the window, it all sharpened my thoughts. I replayed every memory, every conversation with him in the past year. The sudden distance. The arguments over money. The way he looked at me sometimes with a resentment he couldn't hide. Pieces of a puzzle I had ignored were now forcing themselves into place. But I knew better than to confront him now. If I asked him directly, he'd lie. If I accused him, he'd deny. No, the truth needed to reveal itself, not be forced. And so, I made a vow in that bed, staring at the ceiling. I would not only survive my son's betrayal. I would discover the root of it. And when I did, I would teach him a lesson that would echo through every vein in his body: a father's wrath is patient, precise, and merciless. The following morning, I acted as though nothing had happened. I greeted him with the same calm voice, poured my coffee, and even asked about his classes. He avoided my eyes, but he smiled weakly, perhaps relieved I was still alive. He thought his poison had failed. He thought I was unaware. He thought he still had the upper hand. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because now, the game was truly beginning. Michael believed he was the hunter. But in truth, he had already become the prey. And I was going to enjoy watching him squirm. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen blinds, slicing the room into bars of gold and shadow. I sat at the table with my coffee, steam rising in front of me like a veil. My hands were steady, but inside me, a storm brewed. Michael walked in, still wearing yesterday's clothes. His eyes darted from me to the counter, to the floor, anywhere but into my gaze. He mumbled a "Morning, Dad," before pouring himself cereal, his hands trembling just enough for me to notice. If he thought I hadn't seen the powder the night before, then why was he so nervous? Because guilt is a weight no man carries gracefully. I studied him like a hawk studies its prey. The twitch in his jaw, the way he avoided conversation, the silence that stretched between us. He looked like a man with secrets. A boy, really, but one who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I wanted to ask him. I wanted to slam my hand on the table and demand to know why. But instead, I smiled. I smiled and asked about his plans for the day. He told me he had class and that he'd be out most of the afternoon. But his voice cracked halfway through the word, and I knew. He was lying. The boy I raised was gone. What stood before me now was a man learning how to live with treachery in his bones. When he left, I followed. Not close enough to be seen, but close enough to know. I watched him take a route that had nothing to do with campus. I watched him slip into a part of town where college boys don't belong, into a neighborhood that smelled of rust, cigarettes, and regret. He was hiding something. Something dangerous. That night, when he returned, his shirt smelled faintly of smoke. His knuckles were scraped raw. And in his eyes, I saw a fire I had not put there. He was unraveling. Slowly. Carelessly. And I was patient. I would wait. I would let the truth crawl out of him like a worm from rotten fruit. But make no mistake. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was preparing. Because whatever secret my son was nursing in the shadows, I knew one thing for certain: it would not end with whispered lies. It would end with blood. It began with the smell. Not the faint smoke from the night before, but something sharper, metallic, like iron left too long in the rain. When Michael hugged me in passing, I caught it clinging to his jacket. Blood has a way of leaving its fingerprint on the air. Subtle, but undeniable. I didn't ask. Not yet. Instead, I began to watch more carefully. Every movement, every glance, every word. The boy who once bounced into this house with laughter in his voice now entered like a shadow, silent, tense, with eyes that lingered too long on locked doors and windows. He thought he was careful. He wasn't. One night, after he'd gone to bed, I slipped into his room. The faint glow of his phone charger lit the edge of his desk, and that's where I saw it. His backpack, heavier than it should have been. Inside, tucked between his textbooks, was a roll of cash bound tight with a rubber band. Not a few bills, hundreds. More than any college kid should be carrying. I put it back. Slowly. Quietly. And when I left his room, I realized something I had known all along but refused to admit. My son wasn't just hiding something, he was living a double life. The next morning, he avoided me again, his answers short, clipped, rehearsed. His hands bore fresh scrapes, his knuckles purple from impact. He tried to hide them in the sleeves of his hoodie, but I noticed. I always noticed. Then came the call. He didn't hear it. He had left his phone buzzing on the counter while he stepped out to grab the mail. I shouldn't have looked, but a father doesn't ignore the things that whisper in the dark. The caller ID read, Vince. The message that followed was brief, cold, and chilling. You're late. Don't screw this up again. My son. My blood. My only child. What had he become entangled in? The questions gnawed at me. Drugs? Debt? Violence? Every possibility was a blade twisting deeper into my chest. But one thing was certain, whatever rope he had tied himself to, it was pulling him further away from the boy I raised and closer towards something darker. I didn't confront him. Not yet. A hunter doesn't spring the trap too soon. Instead, I waited. I listened. And I prepared myself for the moment when all the shadows he carried would spill out into the light. Because motives, like secrets, cannot be buried forever. They rot. They spread. And sooner or later, they surface. And when his did, I wasn't sure if I'd see the son I loved standing before me. Or a stranger I'd no longer recognize. It was past midnight when Michael slipped out of the house again. He thought I was asleep, but fathers don't sleep when their sons carry secrets this heavy. I followed him. Not close enough to be seen, but near enough to keep his figure in sight as he cut through the quiet streets of Chicago. His hoodie was pulled low, his steps quick and deliberate, like someone moving toward an appointment he couldn't afford to miss. We moved past shuttered diners, dim streetlights flickering overhead, and the echo of our footsteps bouncing off empty sidewalks. At last, he stopped, outside a rundown warehouse on the edge of the city. Its windows were blacked out, its walls tagged with spray paint. The kind of place where nothing good ever happened. Michael hesitated at the door, glancing over his shoulder once. And I melted into the shadows, praying he hadn't seen me. Then he disappeared inside. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. My patience strained against the silence until a figure finally emerged. Not Michael, someone older, broader, with a face carved from cruelty. His hand clutched a duffel bag, heavy with something I couldn't see, and when he stepped beneath the streetlight, I recognized the name inked across his jacket. Vince. The same name from the message on Michael's phone. My stomach dropped. When Michael finally reappeared, his face was pale, his hands trembling. He wasn't carrying money this time, he was carrying something worse. A small black case, the kind you'd only see in crime dramas, tucked under his arm as though it weighed more than the world. And in that moment, the truth began to bleed through the edges. This wasn't just about debt. This wasn't just about reckless youth. My son was running errands for dangerous men. As he walked away, I stayed hidden in the dark, fighting the war in my chest. One part of me wanted to drag him back home, shake the truth out of him, scream until every lie broke apart. But the other part knew better. The deeper he was in, the more dangerous a misstep could be, for him, for me, for both of us. So I let him pass. I let him vanish into the night, his shadow swallowed by the city. But I swore to myself, the next time, I wouldn't just follow. The next time, I'd find out exactly what kind of fire my son was playing with. And who else was standing too close to the flames. Because Michael wasn't just keeping secrets anymore. He was keeping time. And I could feel it ticking down to something inevitable. I couldn't get the image out of my head. Michael's trembling hands clutching that black case. Vince's cold, hard face lit by the streetlight. Sleep never came that night. By morning, I was already at my desk, staring at my laptop, fingers frozen over the keyboard. Searching for Vince Chicago felt too simple, too naive. Men like him didn't parade their names online, they hid in whispers, in back alleys, in debts that never made it to paper. But I dug anyway. Hours blurred. Old news articles, scraps of court reports, names buried in neighborhood blogs no one read. The deeper I went, the uglier the picture became. Vincent Moretti. A ghost in the city. Arrested twice in his 20s, assault and possession, but never convicted. His name kept surfacing in stories of raids that went wrong, shipments that vanished, men who disappeared and were never seen again. The police files were thin, but the gap spoke louder than the words. Vince wasn't just some low-level thug. He was a middleman. A bridge between the desperate and the untouchable. And my son had just walked across that bridge. I sat back in my chair, the weight pressing on my chest until I could barely breathe. A father is supposed to protect his child, guide him away from cliffs like this. But here I was, trailing behind, scrambling to make sense of footprints already left in concrete. That evening, I made a choice. Instead of following Michael, I went ahead of him. I drove to the warehouse before midnight, parked down the block, and watched. For an hour, nothing. Just shadows shifting across boarded windows. Then, movement, 2 cars rolled up, their headlights cut, and men spilled out. Not boys. Men. Hard faces. Heavy coats. The kind who carried weight under their clothes. They slipped inside, one by one, swallowed by the warehouse doors. A meeting. A deal. Something I wasn't supposed to see. And then, out of the corner of my eye, Michael. Approaching slow, hesitant, like prey stepping into a hunter's den. I wanted to scream his name, drag him back into the safety of the car, but I froze. Because in that instant, I realized something. Michael wasn't just delivering packages. He was trusted enough to be invited inside. The truth closed in tighter. My son wasn't circling the edges of this darkness anymore. He was standing in its center. And Vince. Vince was the one pulling the strings. The morning after the warehouse stakeout, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I didn't hear Michael come down the stairs, but I felt him, like the way you feel a shift in the air before a storm. He moved quietly, carefully, avoiding eye contact as he poured himself cereal. That's when I decided to push. Long night? I asked, my voice calm, casual, too casual. Michael froze for half a second. Most wouldn't have noticed it, but a father notices everything. Yeah, he said finally, shrugging. Studying. Fell asleep at the library. I nodded, taking a slow sip of my bitter coffee. The first lie. Library closes at 10, I murmured, not looking up. He hesitated again, then covered it quickly. I stayed with friends afterward. We were working on a project. Another lie. His voice carried that edge of forced nonchalance, like he'd rehearsed excuses in the mirror. Good, I said softly. Glad to hear you're still working hard. He smiled then, brief and tight, before burying himself in his bowl. His mask was good, but not perfect. A bead of sweat formed just above his temple. His hand shook ever so slightly when he raised the spoon. And my heart broke quietly inside me. Because my son wasn't a natural liar. He wasn't built for this world. Yet here he was, learning to bend truth like steel, teaching himself to hide from the one person who had always been his safe place. I decided to lean harder. I heard about a place down on South Halsted, I said suddenly, feigning casual interest. Old warehouse, burned out windows, looks abandoned. Strange how many cars are there at night. Michael's spoon stopped midway to his mouth. His eyes flicked to mine, just for a heartbeat, sharp, startled, then gone. I wouldn't know, he said quickly, forcing a laugh. Why would I know about some creepy warehouse? And that's when I knew for certain. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't playing dumb. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And he was terrified that I knew too. The silence between us stretched thin, almost unbearable. I let him finish eating. I didn't press further. I couldn't, not yet. But as he left the table and walked out the door, his back seemed heavier than his frame could carry. For the first time, I saw not just my son, but a boy standing at the edge of a cliff, pretending he wasn't already falling. And I realized, if I didn't act soon, Vince would push him the rest of the way. The city never really sleeps, but some streets know a darker kind of life after midnight. That night, I left the safety of my home behind and drove toward the south side, headlights cutting through a drizzle that made the pavement shine like glass. I wasn't following Michael this time. I was following Vince. I'd spotted him earlier that evening outside the high school, parked too far down the block, his window rolled just low enough to watch the kids pour out. When Michael slipped into his car, my chest turned to stone. But I didn't follow them right away. I waited, memorized the plates, then circled until I found Vince's trail again. And now here I was, tailing him through the industrial district. The warehouse loomed larger the closer we got, its bricks blackened by years of neglect, its windows hollowed like empty eyes. The place reeked of secrets. Vince pulled in first, parking among a scattered row of cars. I killed my lights half a block away and slid into the shadows. From there, I watched. Men emerged from the warehouse, thick jackets, hard faces, the kind of men who didn't smile without reason. One of them shook Vince's hand, and something passed between them, a package, wrapped tight in brown paper. Vince tucked it under his arm like a prized possession. My pulse pounded in my ears. Drugs? Money? Whatever it was, it wasn't legal. I stepped out of my car, staying low, hugging the darkness as I moved closer. My shoes scraped gravel, each sound too loud, each breath too sharp. And then I saw him. Michael. Standing at the edge of the group, shoulders stiff, eyes darting everywhere but never settling. He wasn't holding a package. He wasn't laughing like the others. He was just there. Present, but apart. Like a kid wearing clothes that didn't fit. One of the men shoved something into his hands, a smaller bundle, and Michael's fingers fumbled around it clumsily, betraying his inexperience. Vince chuckled, slapping him on the back like a proud coach. And my stomach turned. Because I understood then. Michael wasn't here by choice. He was here because Vince was pulling him deeper, one errand at a time. Breaking him in. Testing how far my son could go before there was no coming back. I clenched my fists in the shadows, every instinct screaming to run in, grab him, drag him away. But if I did that, I'd blow everything. Vince would know I was watching. Michael would know I didn't trust him. So I stayed hidden, my nails biting into my palms, watching my boy hold a package that weighed more than his entire future. And as Vince lit a cigarette, the glow of his lighter briefly illuminated the scar across his cheek. A scar I'd seen before, years ago, when I'd worked cases downtown. Vince wasn't just some petty hustler. He'd been connected to a crew back then, the kind of crew that left bodies behind when they cleaned up. Now he was standing feet from my son. And in that moment, under the drizzle, under the hum of flickering streetlights, I made a vow. If Vince wanted to drag Michael into his world, he'd have to go through me first. The next morning, my reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, eyes sunken, jaw tight, the kind of face that hadn't slept but had made a decision. I couldn't just watch anymore. Watching was killing me. Michael ate his cereal at the table, head down, spoon scraping against the bowl in restless circles. He didn't look at me. And I didn't ask questions, not yet. If I pressed him too hard, he'd shut down completely. But I made a silent promise as I sipped my coffee, this ends before it devours him. That night, I drove back to the warehouse. Not to spy, at least not in the same way. This time, I came prepared. I parked farther out, hidden in a thicket of weeds, and pulled a small camera from my glove box. Years ago, I'd used tools like this on the job. Now it felt strange, almost dangerous, putting those old instincts back to work. But desperation sharpens memory. Through the long lens, I captured Vince meeting the same hard-faced men as before. Packages traded hands. Cash exchanged. I kept the camera steady, forcing myself not to tremble even as every nerve wanted to scream. And then, like a knife to the gut, I saw Michael again. He was carrying another bundle, smaller this time, and walking it toward a black SUV that idled at the curb. He moved awkwardly, like someone rehearsing a role he didn't want. The men laughed at his clumsiness, Vince clapping him on the shoulder again like he was grooming him for something bigger. I snapped photos until my memory card was nearly full. Each image was proof, not just of Vince, but of the danger Michael was sinking into. But I didn't leave right away. Instead, I slipped out of the car and crept closer, hugging the shadows until I could hear Vince's voice over the rain-slicked pavement. "He's coming along fine," Vince was saying, smoke curling from his lips. "Just a matter of time before he gets comfortable. He's young, but he's got potential." Potential. That word seared into me like fire. They weren't using Michael, they were shaping him. Bending him into something I couldn't allow. When the men retreated inside, I slid back to my car, adrenaline shaking through me. I had enough evidence to get Vince watched, maybe even arrested if the right people still owed me favors. But the thought clawed at me, going to the authorities meant Michael's name would be dragged into it, too. His face on record. His life stained. And I couldn't let that happen. No. This had to be handled differently. Quietly. That's when I made the choice. I would take Vince apart myself, strip him of his power, expose him, cut him off from every angle, before he ever got the chance to fully claim my son. And as I drove home, the storm outside mirrored the one building inside me. Because this was no longer about watching. This was war. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the dark at the kitchen table, the photographs spread out like a deck of cursed cards. Vince's smirk stared back at me from every angle, the men around him faceless devils. By sunrise, I knew what I had to do. Vince thrived on power. On control. The respect his men gave him was currency, and if I could chip away at that, just enough, it would leave cracks for everything else to follow. So I started small. That afternoon, while Michael was still at school, I drove to the warehouse. My heart hammered as I approached, but I forced myself to move with the calm precision of a man who'd walked into danger before. I didn't step inside. Not yet. Instead, I found the gas line that ran along the side of the building, tucked between rusted panels and graffiti scars. I didn't need to blow the place sky high. I just needed to remind Vince that shadows can bite. With steady hands, I loosened the valve just enough that anyone inside would smell the sharp sting of gas within an hour. Not enough to cause an explosion, just enough to spook them. Then I slipped a small envelope under the warehouse door. Inside was one of the photographs I'd taken of him, Vince, cigarette in hand, laughing in the rain outside his den of sin. On the back, I wrote only 6 words. I see you. He's mine. That evening, Michael came home quieter than usual. He set his bag down, avoiding my eyes, and retreated upstairs. I let him. Because minutes later, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I answered. Bold move, a voice drawled. Vince. His tone was smooth, but there was an edge under it, a hint of anger he couldn't quite mask. You're trespassing where you don't belong, he continued. I don't like ghosts creeping around my house. I said nothing. Let silence do the talking. Vince chuckled low. You think you're clever. But you've made one mistake, you're showing me you care. And when a man cares, he bleeds easy. The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone, my pulse steady. Because for the first time, Vince had acknowledged me. He knew I was there. And that meant the game had changed. Later that night, I watched from the window as Michael's light stayed on far too late. He was restless. Nervous. I could almost feel the weight pressing down on him. But I didn't go to him. Not yet. Because the war had begun, and if Vince thought he could scare me into retreat, he was about to learn the hard way. I'd already decided how far I was willing to go. And mercy wasn't on the list. I knew Vince wouldn't let my message breathe long. Men like him couldn't stand the taste of fear in their mouths without spitting it back out, sharper, bloodier. And he didn't disappoint. The next evening, as twilight bled across the rooftops, Michael came home earlier than usual. His face was pale, his hands trembling when he set his backpack down on the table. There was a car, he whispered, his voice tight. It followed me all the way from school. Black sedan. Tinted windows. It didn't stop until I ran up the block. I felt the shift in my gut. A warning shot. Vince wasn't hiding anymore, he was stepping into the daylight of my son's world. I drove Michael to his friend's house that night under the guise of a sleepover, but it wasn't to protect him, it was to free me. To move without his eyes watching, without his fear weighing me down. Because Vince had drawn first blood. And now, I was ready to draw more. By midnight, the storm broke. The pounding on my front door wasn't subtle. Heavy fists, deliberate. I reached for the pistol I kept tucked beneath the couch cushion and moved with the silence of a man who'd spent years preparing for this exact kind of hell. 3 men stood outside when I cracked the blinds, hulking shadows dressed in leather and arrogance. They weren't here to talk. I slipped out the back door before they could break through, circling around the side of the house. My heart hammered, but my steps were steady. When the first thug kicked the door open, I was already behind him. The butt of my pistol cracked against his skull, dropping him before he could shout. The second spun, knife in hand, but I drove my shoulder into his gut and sent him crashing through the hallway table. The third. He ran. Cowards always run when the shadows fight back. But here's the thing about Vince, he never truly loses. Not in his own mind. Because the moment I caught my breath, I realized what he'd really done. Not a home invasion. Not a scare tactic. A message. On the wall above my mantel, in thick black spray paint, they'd left 3 words. He is mine. Michael. I stood there in the wreckage of my living room, my chest heaving, the stink of paint choking the air. And for the first time, I felt something worse than fear. Vince wasn't hiding anymore. He was stepping right into my home, planting his flag where my family lived, where my son slept. The war was no longer silent. No longer in shadows. It was open. Bloody. And I knew exactly what my next move had to be. The wreckage of my living room still smelled of fear and paint when I made my decision. Enough waiting. Enough bleeding. Vince wanted to claim my son, to plant his filthy mark inside my home. Fine. I would answer him in a language he understood. War. The first step was information. Vince thrived on power because people didn't dare look behind the curtain. But I wasn't just anyone, I had years of contacts, favors tucked away like hidden knives. I called in one of those knives that night. An old friend from my days in the service, now buried deep inside the county records office. He owed me, and debts are like shadows, they never vanish, they just wait for light to expose them. Within hours, I had what I needed, a trail of Vince's shell companies, property deeds under false names, and, most important, an abandoned warehouse sitting at the edge of the docks in Baltimore. On paper it was empty. In reality, it was the artery feeding his empire, storage for shipments, weapons, money laundering fronts. It wasn't just a target. It was leverage. I scouted the place the next evening, slipping through the rain like a ghost. The warehouse loomed black and massive, lights flickering at the corners. Men smoked cigarettes near the loading bay, their laughter sharp and careless. They didn't expect anyone to watch them. Vince had made them arrogant. Good. Arrogance makes men sloppy. I traced their routines, counted heads, memorized the shift changes. Every detail became a weapon in my mind. And when I was certain, I planted my gift. An unmarked burner phone tucked inside a steel locker. Preset to detonate the C4 bricks I wired along the north wall. Not to collapse the whole place, no, not yet. Just enough to send a message. Just enough to make Vince choke on his own certainty. The explosion tore through the docks just past 2 a.m. A rolling boom that shattered glass for blocks and painted the night sky in fire. By the time the sirens wailed, I was already gone. Watching from a ridge a mile away, my breath fogging in the cold. Because this wasn't destruction. It was a statement. And I made sure Vince got the second half of it. By morning, his private accounts would receive an anonymous video file, footage of the blast, my voice narrating through a distorted filter. Touch my son again, Vince, and I'll burn down everything you've built, one brick at a time. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like a father hiding in the dark. I felt like a man hunting. And Vince? He was finally on the run. The fire from the docks hadn't even cooled before Vince bared his teeth. I knew it would come, men like him don't lick wounds, they sink their claws deeper. But knowing didn't make it easier when it finally happened. It began on a Tuesday morning, quiet and ordinary. Michael was walking home from basketball practice, his sneakers squeaking against the damp pavement. A black sedan slid alongside him like a predator pacing its prey. Before he could react, 2 men stepped out. No words. No threats. Just a chloroform rag and the hiss of tires peeling away. By the time I arrived at the empty court, Michael's bag was still swinging on the chain-link fence. My heart cracked open. The call came hours later. Vince's voice oozed through the phone, smug and cold. "Bold move at the docks," he said. "But let me remind you, your son isn't fireproof." A muffled sound followed. My son's voice. Weak, terrified. "Dad." Then silence. My fists clenched around the phone, nails biting into skin. I wanted to scream, to tear through the line and strangle Vince with my bare hands. But instead, I forced my voice steady. "What do you want?" He chuckled. "To show you that you can't win. To make you watch everything you love unravel. You set fire to my world, so now I'll set fire to yours, starting with your blood." The call ended, leaving me staring at the dead line, rage and fear twisting inside me like barbed wire. By nightfall, his message was carved even deeper. I found my house vandalized again, only this time, it wasn't just paint. Photographs of Michael, taken while he slept, while he walked home from school, while he ate breakfast at the table, were scattered across the floor. Each one marked with red slashes. Each one a countdown. He wanted me broken. He wanted me begging. Instead, he gave me clarity. That night, I swore to myself, Vince had declared war on my son, and in doing so, he had signed his own death warrant. The time for warnings was over. Now, I would end this. The night after Vince's call, sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. Every creak of the house, every shadow slipping across the walls, reminded me that Michael was out there, alone, terrified, in the hands of a man who only knew cruelty. I spread maps across my dining table. Printouts of Vince's known businesses. Photographs of his warehouses, his clubs, his so-called fronts. Pins and scribbled notes connected by lines of red string like veins of obsession. I wasn't a detective, but rage can turn any man into a bloodhound. First came the allies. I reached out to Detective Ramirez, the only cop left in this city who hadn't bent under Vince's money. His voice was weary when he answered. "You realize how dangerous this is, don't you?" he said. "I don't care," I replied. "He has my son." There was a pause. Then a sigh. "All right. Meet me at the pier at midnight. But know this, you're crossing a line you can't come back from." I hung up without hesitation. Next came an old friend, Marcus. A man with scars across his knuckles and eyes that had seen too many bar fights. He owed me a favor, and tonight, I collected. "You're serious?" he asked when I told him. "As serious as death," I said. Marcus cracked his neck, his grin half-feral. "Then let's bring hell to his doorstep." By midnight, I had a small army. Just 2 men, really. But men who would stand against the tide with me. Ramirez provided intel, Vince's newest stronghold, a derelict meatpacking plant on the edge of Brooklyn. Supposedly abandoned, but satellite images showed trucks coming and going at odd hours. A perfect place to hide something, or someone. I pinned the location on the map. My finger pressed against it until the paper tore. "That's where he is," I whispered. "That's where Michael is." We spent the next hours gathering what we could. Guns from Ramirez's lockup. Knives and bats from Marcus's trunk. And from my own shed, tools I never thought I'd raise against another man, chains, hammers, crowbars. This wasn't just a rescue. It was war. By dawn, I stood outside the plant's rusted gates, staring at the cracked windows, the skeletal towers looming over the river. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something sharper. I wasn't walking into Vince's stronghold as prey. I was walking in as a father. And God help anyone who stood in my way. The air reeked of rust and rotting meat as we crouched in the shadows outside the plant. The building loomed like a tombstone against the night sky, its broken windows glowing faintly from lights inside. Every instinct screamed that walking in was suicide. But then again, so was letting Vince keep my son. I glanced at Ramirez and Marcus. Ramirez adjusted the pistol at his side, jaw clenched. Marcus hefted a crowbar, his grin gone now, his face hardened like stone. We moved. The first gate gave way under Marcus's crowbar with a shriek of metal. We froze, waiting for the alarm. None came. Just the low hum of generators inside. We slipped through, boots crunching on gravel. Inside, the corridors were a maze of rusted catwalks and hanging chains. The echoes made it impossible to tell if footsteps were ours or someone else's. We descended deeper into the plant, the walls closing in with every turn. Then we saw them, 2 guards by a door at the far end of the corridor. Ramirez signaled. Silence. Swift. I crept closer, the hammer in my grip slick with sweat. One of the guards turned just enough to see me, and in that split second, I swung. Bone cracked under the blow. The man dropped like a stone. Marcus lunged at the other, pinning him against the wall until the life drained from his body. No alarms. No shouts. Just the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. We pressed on. The door led to a staircase spiraling down into the bowels of the plant. Cold air drifted up, carrying the scent of mildew and something worse. When we reached the bottom, I saw it. A cell. Inside, hunched on a cot, was Michael. His face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief when they landed on me. "Dad," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Something inside me broke. My knees nearly gave out. But before I could answer, the lights blazed on. A dozen men emerged from the shadows, guns in their hands, smirks on their faces. And at the center of them, clapping slowly, was Vince. Well, he drawled. The old man actually came. I raised the hammer, every nerve screaming at me to charge. But Vince only grinned wider. "You should have stayed home. Because now, you're not leaving." The moment Vince's smirk cut across the room, I knew he had been waiting for me. The bastard had turned the rescue into a stage, and I was the main act. "Drop the hammer," he sneered, pacing slowly, his men forming a ring around us. "Or watch your boy bleed." Michael's eyes locked on mine, trembling, chained at the wrists. His lips formed one word, "Don't." I didn't drop the hammer. Instead, I swung. The first man lunged at me, but the steel claw of the hammer split his temple open with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the concrete. Chaos exploded. Ramirez fired, the gunshots thundering through the chamber. Marcus charged like a bull, crowbar slamming into ribs, bones snapping like twigs. Screams echoed. Bullets sparked against steel. I ducked, rolled, swung, another skull caved in beneath my hammer. The room became a slaughterhouse, the air thick with gunpowder and blood. Vince stood back, watching, waiting, letting his men fall like pawns on a chessboard. When only 2 remained, he stepped forward, gun in hand. "You think this ends with you saving him?" he snarled, spittle flying. "You think you win? No. This ends with me putting you in the ground." He raised the gun. I hurled the hammer. It spun through the air, striking his wrist with bone-shattering force. The gun clattered away, his scream piercing the chaos. I was on him in a second. Fists slammed into his face, again and again, until my knuckles split open and his blood smeared across my skin. He clawed back, gouging, biting, fighting like a cornered animal. We crashed into the cot, metal screeching. Chains rattled as Michael screamed, "Dad!" Vince got his hands around my throat, eyes wild, spit and blood dripping from his mouth. His grip was iron. My vision blurred. But then, my hand found the hammer again. With the last ounce of strength in my body, I swung upward. The claw end buried deep into his skull. Vince's eyes rolled back. His grip loosened. And then he collapsed, twitching, blood pooling beneath him. Silence. Just my gasps, Michael's sobs, Ramirez's heavy breathing, Marcus groaning as he held his side. I dropped to my knees, yanked the chains off my son's wrists, and pulled him into my arms. "It's over," I whispered. My voice broke. "It's finally over." We staggered out of that slaughterhouse together, father and son, bloodied but alive. Behind us, Vince's empire rotted in the dark. And though I knew scars would remain, one truth settled in my chest like iron. I had taken back my son. And no one, not even the devil himself, would ever take him from me again.